definitely as a society, we are largely misguided. We don't know where to get our information from. And that is a challenge for sure. So really understanding, for take home points for the listeners is really understanding where the information is coming from, the biases and the viewpoints of the scientists who are speaking or the health providers that are translating that information, and, being open-minded to question the current narratives like, hey, man, maybe we should think about the fact that, cattle and agriculture don't in the US have that big of an impact on climate change or greenhouse gas. And that perhaps, the majority of our food travels 1,300 miles if it's, plant foods. And if you live in Minnesota, you probably shouldn't be eating avocados in the middle of winter if you care about the environment. So there's all these other things as opposed to make it very binary, like this is this or this. It's not black and white.
That's so good that you brought that up, because for one, it's not true, right? We're debunking all the myths of environmental damage, but also to go back to your point, if you're sitting next to the bedside of someone with a broken hip who didn't eat enough protein their whole life, didn't have enough muscle mass, are they caring about the 0.001% difference in the climate change from a cow versus like a piece of broccoli? Yeah. That, like, are they like, oh man, well, I'm so glad that I 0.001% change because I decided to avoid protein. They are devastated and dying.
And, it is a, yes. So no one is saying that they at their, bedside saying, man, I wish I ate more broccoli.
Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
Sento apogeo.
Pico ninguém.
O melhor humano.
Picówka nie miód.
Hello. I am back in LA. Made some great progress in the Food Lies film, making some breakthroughs here, trying to crack this code of how to tell this story. Such a long story. So many points to get across. Seems like an endless task to put this puzzle piece together, but we're doing it. So on to today's episode. Had a great podcast with Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. We've been trying to do a podcast for quite a while, and we finally got it done. She is an amazing resource on protein. She practices what she calls muscle-centric medicine. She's all about maintaining that muscle mass, eating enough protein, living long and staying strong, and having muscle mass until you age. We talked about tons of stuff, including fat-focused paradigm, the protein paradigm, how the current medical professionals are very misguided, plant-based protein compared to animal, old age and protein, ethical issues, environmental issues, and some actionable stuff at the end. Also, we get into the lean gains and going to failure at the end in the bonus part of the podcast for Sapien Tribe members. So you can go to sapien.org and go down to the tribe and join us there and get the bonus episodes, get the show notes, get all the other stuff. Dr. Gabrielle Lyon received her doctorate in osteopathic medicine from the Arizona College of Osteopathic Medicine and is board certified in family medicine. She earned her undergraduate degree in human nutrition from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where she studied vitamin and mineral metabolism, chronic disease prevention and management, and the physiological effects of diet composition. She also completed a research/clinical fellowship in nutritional science and geriatrics at Washington University in St. Louis. A lot of great stuff here. Too bad it was a bit short, but check it out. And I'll also tell you about my favorite products from Nose to Tail. I'll do a quick new version of this instead of going on and on about all our great stuff. It's all at nosetotale.org, by the way. But I guess my favorite thing is the Peri Peri Biltong. This is the spicy flavor. It's a South African biltong. Way softer than beef jerky. Has extra fat. It's really great for on the go. It was great to have in Hawaii. Second favorite, got to be the primal ground beef. Always got to get the primal ground beef in your diet. We have that at nosetotale.org. You can get free shipping if you order over 20 pounds. This stuff is delivered right to your door. It has kidney, heart, liver, and spleen mixed in. Best way to get in organ meats in their whole form without really tasting them. And the best way to do that is my third favorite product, Primal Seasoning, the Primal Special. You can get those on their own or when you order a meat box, but we have 7 seasonings. The Primal Special is great on burgers and basically anything, but we have a bunch of others for all other uses. Number 4 favorite product would be the Brunei Skin Food. I'm doing one product from each category. So the Skin Food is my favorite out of the beef tallow handmade body care products we make. We do soap and lip balm, and Skin Food coming out with a few more soon. But the Skin Food is really the first body care product I actually started even using. And it smells really good. It's made with cedarwood and bergamot. Just a couple ingredients, regenerative beef tallow. And those are 4 main product categories. We have hats. I'm looking at a steak hat right now. It's pretty great to just have a giant steak on a hat. Why not? So check all those out at nosetail.org and then sapien.org. Like I said, we have the tribe there. We also have the Sapien program for people who want to get healthy. They want some guidance. It does take guidance. I mean, all the information's out there, but you got to find it all. You got to listen to all 111 episodes of this podcast. But still, you still might need some guidance. Health coaching, we have your back. Physician supervise. We have Dr. Gary leading the way. It's all online. You can do it remotely. Lots of videos, health coaching remotely. All the good stuff, sapien.org. So that's about it. Let's get on to the show with Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. All right, we're live with Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm so glad we finally got to sync up.
It's been a while, it's been years in the making. We actually connected maybe a year and a half ago. We went to Fogo de Chao with Dr. Sean Baker and a little crew.
Yeah, that's right. That was fun.
Yeah, you were pregnant back then.
I think I was pregnant then too. I was actually.
Yeah, I remember you were crushing some meat, with the pregnant belly there. That was great.
Yeah.
Well, lots to get into. You also were in the Game Changers Debunked film, which was great. You submitted a video so that I wanted to let people know, go back and check that out. It's on YouTube. We put it all together. It's the same length film as the Game Changers film, which is kind of funny that we debunked it. And yeah, thanks for submitting that. And man, all right, there's so much to get into here. Maybe you could describe what you do, because I love that you call it muscle-centric medicine, right? Let's dive into that.
So first of all, my name is Gabrielle Lyon and I'm a physician, and I practice this concept of medicine called muscle-centric medicine. And it was really birthed from my experience through my undergraduate in human nutrition, vitamin, mineral metabolism, then of course medical school, and then 2 residencies and a fellowship. And it was during my fellowship, which I did at WashU in St. Louis, in geriatrics, obesity medicine, and then nutritional sciences. And I had this moment, kind of like this epiphany, where I realized that we were focusing on the wrong tissue. So I would say that our society and the culture at large focuses on adiposity, and that is the wrong tissue to be focusing on. That's secondary to impaired skeletal muscle, which comes first. And, we were talking previously before we started recording this, that the aging process and population is arguably the most vulnerable and also going to be the most significant, because right now we're all young and healthy, but eventually there is a inflection point that will happen, and aging is inevitable. So really, ultimately, this concept of muscle-centric medicine is shifting the paradigm away from adiposity, because accumulation of fat tissue is a secondary symptomology of impaired skeletal muscle.
That's super important. I never thought of it that way. You're kind of flipping it, right? A lot of people just focus on their fat, but if you get your muscle right, you can affect your fat.
Well, and also the pathophysiology, if you think about it. So insulin resistance is a really hot topic. And there's a lot of people that are talking about insulin resistance and obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. But insulin resistance starts in the skeletal muscle. It does not start in other tissues. So skeletal muscle insulin resistance begins first. Yet everyone is still talking about adiposity, visceral fat, and being overweight, which, listen, arguably is a problem, and there are consequences to that. But if we truly believe as a community in root cause medicine, the root cause is not adipose tissue causing all the problem. It's impaired skeletal muscle initiating the problem, right? Because people are not training, or they have fat infiltration, not due to exercise in their skeletal muscle. They are eating sub-threshold protein amounts, which is incredibly common. According to the NHANES data, the average American eats 80 grams of protein a day. and the RDA is sufficient for preventing disease, but certainly not optimization. So, if we truly believe in a root cause approach, talking about fat tissue is, not the correct focus.
Mm-hmm. That's so important. Well, man, maybe you can go into that a little more. Yeah, because we're so fat focused, and just keep going on that.
Yeah. So, this concept of so we actually, if you think about it, have a failure of a fat focused paradigm. So since the beginning, the Jane Fonda era, or even just really as we think about the beginning of what that looked like, the perspective and the narrative has always been about being fat focused. Mm-hmm. What we're seeing is a failure of that paradigm. And yet, so the recidivism rate, the relapse rate, 1 in 3 Americans is obese. The relapse rate of gaining and losing the same 5 to 10 to 20 pounds is tremendous, right? The majority of people will gain it back. In that process, they destroy skeletal muscle. And they continue to put on body fat, and it becomes this cyclical thing that happens. And then what happens is, as you age, the then tissue has an anabolic resistance component. So our skeletal muscle doesn't, have the same metabolic capacity as it does from birth to death. It changes. So if we don't account for that changing hormonal milieu and really adapt to the consequences of aging and the consequences of more of a domesticated lifestyle, then we'll continue to have this failure of this fat-focused paradigm, which we do. Everybody is talking about adipose tissue. That's the wrong tissue. Symptomology, symptom-based issues start in skeletal muscle, and it begins there first, and arguably begins there decades before you see issues with blood sugar changes, before you see issues with cholesterol. And of course, I don't say that to be all-encompassing. There's always genetic components. There isn't always, but there can be genetic components, which of course arguably would skew this conversation. However, it would behoove us to really pay attention and perhaps think that we've missed the mark by focusing on adipose tissue.
It is. There's always that progression that people go downhill, but I think it's really important that they don't have the muscle. If you don't focus on the protein or muscle, that's why the yo-yo dieting happens. Right. The yo-yo, people know these numbers is 97% of diets fail, because if you never focus on the right things, you try all these different crash diets, you do all these things, you can count calories, you do whatever method of sort of bad dieting you can do. If you don't address the root cause.
Right.
And
totally. Yeah. It's interesting because the root cause is not this adipose tissue. People talk about the growth of adipocytes and the issues in the inflammatory cytokines that it generates, the adipokines. All of that is a problem, right? But that is not the root cause issue. If you have healthy skeletal muscle and you are training and your body composition is optimized, you will largely not have these issues.
Muscle mops up glucose.
It does. It is responsible for a large majority of glucose disposal. It is 70% easy of glucose disposal is based in skeletal muscle. And then, of course, when you augment that with movement, resistance training, or any kind of exercise, you now increase the disposal.
So, for one, I just made a post about this today on Instagram where you have to earn your carbs. So this it's pretty tied in here, but we recommend, you need this many carbs. It's like 40% of your diet, this and that. It's like we're recommending a Michael Phelps amount of carbs for people who sit behind their desk all day.
Yeah.
So just
totally interesting. So the average American ingests 300 grams of carbs a day. And again, this is from the NHANES data set, which is the largest data set that we have. 300 grams of carbs. The RDA is roughly 130. And arguably that's too much.
Most people don't earn them. Like, just think of that earning paradigm, which I'm sure you kind of agree with, right? It's like some people can burn them off, but some people can't. You can't burn 300 grams of carbs. It's just not going to happen.
And then the issue is, listen, caloric load does matter. A lot of people say that calories in, calories out don't matter. It is certainly not that simple, but that as a foundational conversation, it does matter. Of course, there's changes in metabolic efficiency that happens, and we've seen that in the Bouchard twin studies. But, what you're saying is absolutely right as it relates to carbohydrate intake and carbohydrate tolerance. You have to earn your carbohydrates. And listen, arguably protein generates enough carbs through gluconeogenesis that you don't need to be ingesting extra carbs. There's no essential need for carbohydrates, truly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you think about a quote balanced diet, perhaps you can add that in, like for me, I have some berries, or maybe I'll have some avocado, which is largely fat, but there's a little bit of carbohydrates there. But the body doesn't necessarily need it.
I love that, because people don't always know that. I mean, people in our community know that, but it's just good to make it clear that it's the non-essential thing. Gluconeogenesis can make all it needs. Your brain, needs a bit of glucose, but it also can run ketones, and then also your liver will make it if you need it. So
yeah, there's really interesting, and of course this number varies, but for every 100 grams of protein that you ingest, your body can generate roughly 60 grams of protein, or 60 grams of carbohydrates.
Yeah.
Right, through the glucogenic amino acids and through gluconeogenesis. So it's interesting.
Yeah. So I just want to go back to the protein stuff in general, because I'm writing the film. We're like kind of rewriting it. There's this whole story. Everyone's like, when's the film coming out? And, I'm working daily. We're going to make it better. Don't worry. Just wait. But what I've kind of come to this realization, part of why it's taking so long is you have new ideas and new things are happening. And I kind of came to this more protein focused paradigm lately and understood why. I was trying to look back why we went wrong, right? I'm always interested what went wrong over the past 40 years. Maybe the 1980 was that big, uptick in obesity. Yeah. And I think I've really landed on these two very clear points. It's we didn't understand that protein was different from other calories. And we didn't understand that processed carbs and fat weren't the same as whole carbs and fat, right? So if you don't know the difference between whole food carbs and whole fat, which is animal fat, and then processed fat, I'd call plant, seed oils. If you don't understand the difference between those, and even satiety, right? Like the satiety between processed carbs and whole carbs is different. And then if you don't understand that protein is more important and more satiating, and you can talk more about the protein, then we just don't recommend it enough. People end up with low protein, like you said, and that's kind of like this base of the problem. Think of the base of the food pyramid. We have the base of the food pyramid is all these carbs, and then we have the fruits and veg, and then we finally get to the protein. So that's kind of what you're saying here is we missed the mark on protein, and I think that really explains a lot of this epidemic.
Yeah. And I think so that's absolutely right. We did miss the mark as it relates to protein. And, I think that there's two components to that. I think it's more of a plant-based narrative that we're hearing, which is really a problem. And it's not particularly factual, but what happens is there's like this diffusion of ideas that start from the medical professionals that are still telling people to not eat dietary cholesterol, right? And that too much red meat is bad for you. So there are these misinterpretations of information. And I think that narrative in and of itself is incredibly inaccurate and incredibly skewed. And, I still am so blown away when other healthcare professionals will look at epidemiology data or look at really low quality information and make global health recommendations to their patients or, on their social media and say red meat, can have cancerous impacts, which is a whole other that's like nonsense and a whole other story. But that, there's this difficulty with biases, and there are unintended consequences that happen as a result of these biases. So that's one aspect. And that really begins, I was so amazed when I was, I do CMEs and all healthcare professionals are, we're always learning. It's part of the craft. And I remember just recently watching obesity medicine. So there's Obesity Week. And, I did a fellowship in obesity medicine. Part of that was at WashU. Part of the training was obesity medicine. And then redoing, doing these CMEs, which we always do, there was a whole section on how plant-based diets are going to help obesity. And it was so shocking to me that, number one, that this was being promoted, and number two, that this was being disseminated to other physicians. So basically, we already know that Americans have a plant-based diet. So again, this is based on the NHANES data set that we are already eating 70% of a plant-based diet, and whether that comes from corn or processed carbohydrates, whatever it is. But we've already been there, done that, right?
It's like it's failed. Yeah, let's try harder. Do it harder. No.
So, I mean, that's weird that that's happening. And then, there's, of course, the other information that we're, quote, being told we're eating too much meat, which the average meat intake is 1.8 ounces, which that's nothing daily. That's nothing.
Yeah.
And then a subsequent question would be, so what level do we, quote, need to cut back if that was the case, right? So that's the other aspect. And then protein, for whatever reason, is highly emotional. It's highly emotional for people. And that's where the other narrative comes in, or the other confusing aspect is that people create all these stories about, whatever it is that their narrative is, but it is the emotional aspect. And then, of course, the medical professional aspect, which is totally skewed. It's a problem.
Well, it is. So there's two things. So there's the agenda. There's anti-meat agendas, which we know about. Yeah. And actually, I just got off a long podcast with Rob Wolf talking about like the highest levels of like Rob's the man. Yeah. He's been doing it forever, but we're like, why are there these anti-meat agendas? So we won't get into the whole really high level reason of the agendas, but just there's also this medical information that's being passed down. And I gotten into this with Dr. Gary lately, my business partner, and just we need to change this medical system, or even what's affecting, like who is putting out this information. Actually, someone has messaged me online about their nutrition school, and I think it was sponsored by the Seventh-day Adventists or the dietetics associations. And so how do we change like that type of system in getting the information from the top down?
It's really challenging, and that is actually where it becomes a major issue. This is the first time in history that we have non-healthcare professionals like speaking out, saying that, man, perhaps we have this information wrong. That is how dissatisfied, I would say, the majority of people are with the information that they're getting. I'm not sure what the answer is to it, but I can certainly tell you that choosing to follow and learn and read literature from unbiased scientists is absolutely essential. I trained with Dr. Donald Lehman, and I still train with him 20 years later. And he is a scientist of the highest integrity. So I'm sure your listeners are very savvy to him, but he is one of the world leading protein experts. So he's in the group with Stu Phillips and Doug Patton-Jones. And for them, it's really important to produce evidence that is, high quality and repeatable. And I think understanding where you're getting your sources, for example, there's the vegan vegetarian groups out of Harvard, right? And they promote a lot of epidemiology, and they say that this is high quality evidence, but the study came from Harvard, right? Or the study came from Stanford. However, when you look at the science of it, the professionals in the field would say, man, this is like totally like a waste, right? But then the public will say, but this study came from Harvard, so it must be good. This must be right. And then it's all twisted.
Well, yeah, Harvard School of Public Health is not an unbiased organization.
Correct. Correct.
It's not
highly
hyper biased. And then Professor Don Layman, he's sort of this legendary protein researcher. It's not like he came in, with Dr. Sean Baker is like, I want to eat steaks every day and this is my bias. He's just like a researcher that's been doing this for how long? Maybe you can tell us more about his research and what you've done with him. He's
been doing this for, he would kill me, but it's like been 40 years. And he is very well published, very well respected, peer reviewed. He was one of the original guys that did the leucine research, leucine mTOR. He started in Galveston, Texas at Bob Wolf's lab. not Rob Wolf, but Bob Wolf, who is also a legend. So this
Mhm.
is a guy who is highly, highly trained, you know. So they're not just trained in the science, they're also trained in the integrity of the science. And I think that that's largely what's missing with the younger generations of scientists. And when I say younger generations of scientists, they're still 20 years older than you and I, but it is that high quality, evidence-based, non-agenda driven bias that produces good information. And that's really what's missing is people don't know who to turn to. There's issues with trusting their own healthcare professionals, not because healthcare professionals are bad. It's that they're totally misguided, right? So if I hadn't spent 7 years in nutritional training, I would have no idea that this CME that's being put on to teach me about obesity medicine is incorrect, right? So
Well,
these
yeah.
are the problems.
Well, yeah, the plant-based one thing I always say about the plant-based diet, if you're like just looking at the hard science of it, you could tell us more about this, is it's not complete protein and you have to get extra energy to get enough protein. This is what I always like to highlight. Unless you're getting highly refined like protein powders, you're having to eat more carbs.
Right. And we don't know the long-term consequences of that. And I think you did a really good job at the beginning of discussing this, that there's a difference between processed food and non-processed food. And if you are going to choose to get your protein from isolates or highly processed sources, we don't know those long-term consequences. We just don't know. We don't know. We know that estrogen activity is very high in peas. We don't know what those long-term isolate consequences
Or
are.
soy protein.
I mean,
yeah.
Right. And then, the other really big point that you bring up is that we cannot argue the difference between animal and plant being the same, right? There's absolutely no argument there. And I remember doing the show with, who was it? David Katz. And I'm sure he's an incredible guy and an incredible researcher, but he was talking about the bioavailability and the protein quality of plant versus animal, saying that new research has just come out saying that they were equal. Mm-hmm. Right. And as you can imagine, he was the author on this study and he had completely created his own scoring system. And you have to understand that the scoring of amino acids, it either has this amount of leucine in it or it doesn't. It's not up for negotiation. It's a hard, fast, biological, unchanging number. And, it was at that moment that I was like sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, he's really, and this was on the Doctor's TV show, he's really saying this. He's really believing this and saying this to the public. So animal protein and plant protein are different. I mean, they may have the same amino acids, the profiles, which I know that you're incredibly well aware of and your listeners are savvy to, are very different. And then, so there's that aspect. And that, as you said, you have to overconsume calories, largely in the form of carbohydrates, to increase that amino acid content. So for every 6 cups of quinoa, you'll get 1 3-ounce chicken breast. So this is the kind of caloric challenges that we're looking at if you're going to be vegan or vegetarian. Now, what about nutrient bioavailability and protein bioavailability? So for the majority of individuals, they eat 70% of their calories already plant-based, right? Out of that 70, that means there's 30% that's some kind of animal product, whether it's dairy or eggs or whatever. The majority of nutrients comes from that 30%. So you're talking nearly all your bioavailable calcium, your iron, your zinc, selenium, vitamin D,
This is, I love to point this out. I did a episode with my ex-girlfriend and her new vegan boyfriend, and they were so proud of it was okay. But they were so proud of their plant-based diet, but they're like, oh, but we eat oysters and we do this each week. I'm like, okay, so your most crucial nutrients are coming from the animal foods. So it's just a little funny, it's a little ironic that you guys are propping up the plant-based diet when the best part of your diet's coming from the animal foods.
Right. And it's so interesting because it becomes this moral, ethical issue. And when that happens, being, profoundly proud of the dietary choices, it's weird. It becomes this weird conversation. And I think that it's like we now live in a society where everything is offensive, including your food choices. I mean,
Yeah.
anyone else think that is just so weird?
We're in a weird place. Well, 2020 is a weird year, so
I'm going to be offended. It's interesting to see the challenges that we face, not only as a society right now, but also as it relates to our health. And it's interesting to think that there is censorship for health, that the physicians and healthcare practitioners are being taught incorrectly, and that they are largely at the mercy of whoever the powers that be are in terms of education. And if we don't have people that are free thinking and open to other suggestions and alternative information and really challenging that cognitive process of what you think you know, then things become very challenging, and that we will continue to look at this obesity epidemic. And then the other aspect of that is, how do we want to age? So I find it incredibly offensive when people are continuing to promote this plant-based, low-protein diet. I'm a trained geriatrician, which means there is a part of my practice, not currently, but in my fellowship, that was 65 and up. Geriatrics is end of life, right? Geriatrics, and then it transitions to palliative care. So the arguments that we can all have in our 30s, 40s, and 50s about, I'm going to go plant-based, or I'm going to lower my protein, or red meat causes cancer, or meat is bad for the environment, or all this BS of these emotional narratives really take on a different tone. And when that happens, that point where that happens is when you are sitting at the bedside of someone who has broken a hip and is not leaving. That is when everything changes. And hopefully people don't get there. But if they do, they will come to understand that the choices that they've made midlife and the narrative that they're listening to is deadly. You know, vegan, vegetarian, low protein diets have the worst bone density, have the lowest survivability. If an individual falls and breaks a hip, you better believe they're not getting out of A, possibly the hospital, and B, probably getting sent to rehab and never coming out. That is profoundly devastating. And the argument changes, right? So when I listen to this narrative, you know, having been at the other end, spending 2 years, I worked in a freaking nursing home. Mm. Can you imagine what that's like? Mm. You know, they used to call me like the death fairy. You know, you're seeing 30 patients a day on their deathbed when you're rotating through palliative care. Like, that shit is brutal.
I feel you. I mean, Dr. Gary works in palliative care, and he does hospice visits, and he is banging on this drum. And thank you for bringing this up. It's always the young girls on YouTube that are talking about the vegan diets, right? These are the people like, okay, you can get away with just about anything. You can't just, yeah.
And those are the ones that are the rudest, that come on my page, that are just so rude. And it's so weird. They make personal attacks. It's so interesting that our society allows for this kind of behavior, because it's grossly inaccurate, you know, and it's grossly inappropriate. You know, it's interesting when you have people that have actually done the work, like Dr. Gary, and is in the nursing home and is sitting at the bedside of patients dying. It is a whole different level of experience and competence and conversation that can be had versus someone who is on their Instagram and has like the little animal emojis, you know, with the hashtag, you know, vegan lover, loves animals, you know, moon and whatever, tens of, you know, hearts with the butt pictures. I mean, this is like, you know, I don't know if you've ever seen the Crazy Hot Matrix.
No.
Okay, well, I have sent, but this is like the Crazy Hot Matrix for vegan vegetarianism. It's like they're crazy. But it's so inappropriate to, you know, it's like this tribal cultural acceptance. It's like the vegan hotline. You know, if I post something saying how great animal protein is, which it truly is, and we've been eating it for over 2 million years, and it's not necessarily the only way to eat, but it's certainly, you cannot bash the fact that red meat, highly bioavailable protein content is essential or at least optimized for human health, because it is. And of course, I'm not saying it's the only way, but the fact that this then stimulates so much emotion and hate and misconception becomes incredibly damaging to our aging population. And that's really the point.
It does. I think this wraps around with the censorship and freedom of speech, or just people getting triggered, because we need to have discussions on both sides. So it's funny that you're trying to have a discussion and you're saying, hey, I'm with these people who are dying and they need more protein. They need animal foods in their diet. They didn't get them. They were led astray for years. All the old people that I know, they're eating oatmeal. They think the picture of health is oatmeal and fruit, and that's all they eat. And that's what my grandma did. And she suffered a stroke, years ago, and she was thin and healthy, but she didn't have enough. You know what I mean? I won't speculate on what went wrong with her, but so they're trying to censor you for saying something, or just to bring it to COVID, where both my parents are gone already at 31. And so I can't speak out. So then if I speak out on something about a lockdown or COVID, how we might be not handling it correctly, then people are like, oh, but I know someone who died, or my grandma died. I was like, okay, well, both my parents are gone. I mean, can we not discuss this? Like, we need to discuss things, and then we can have both sides of the argument, and then we can make decisions. Yeah. And it's just, yeah. All right.
And I think that you bring up a good point. I do think there needs to be discussions. And I do think with those discussions come very respectful conversations. I think that where the issue becomes and where things start to become really challenging is when, at each level there's issues. So at the level that you're talking about, when you're discussing it with peers or other people, and they're just incredibly disrespectful. And then there's the aspect of physician to physician discussions, which are also incredibly disrespectful and inappropriate. Right. So we now live in a time, like you said, where everybody is offended, and it's a challenge because the way that I grew up, and, I'm married to a SEAL, there is a certain level of respect that comes with being able to have a conversation, and a certain level of respect given, which I find that is not happening anymore. And so it's whoever is having the biggest emotional tantrum, then they must be right. Mm-hmm. And that is, and again, and I go back to the aging population, that's who it actually hurts the most. Because their capacity to, well, number one, length of time, and also it's the capacity to gain information and not knowing who to trust. They don't have as much flexibility.
Well, and they're kind of set in their ways. They're like, they already made up their mind. It's sad.
Yeah, it becomes sad. And then when it becomes where the youth is then telling the older population, the elders, to go more plant-based or reduce the red meat, or it's bad for the planet, or all these other narratives. When you tell someone globally to reduce protein, what do you think they eat more of? It's not avocados. What do you think they eat more of?
Yeah, it's carbs. It's like, yeah.
And do you think it's spinach? It's not spinach.
No.
I've been in practice for 15 years. There's a broccoli quota. No one is going to say, you know what? I'm going to cut back my red meat, or I'm going to cut back my protein, and I'm going to eat an extra 10 servings of spinach. That just doesn't happen in clinical practice. In real life, it doesn't happen. So we have to be very careful about the recommendations and the unintended consequences of what these recommendations result in. What they result in is more obesity. And listen, and we know that obesity midlife can definitely be a component to later life Alzheimer's. I mean, I did that when I was at WashU. We imaged people's brains. So the wider the waistline, the lower the brain volume. The damage you do in midlife, diabetes is type 3, Alzheimer's is type 3 diabetes.
Yeah.
Like happens midlife, and it happens with impaired body composition, So these issues really, we have to kind of hammer them out as a society and as a community.
Absolutely. And so that was my mom. My mom had Alzheimer's, and so she had no muscle mass, but she wasn't obese. That's the thing, is that in society, we just see these people that have the prediabetes, don't know it, have the sugar problems. They goes into their brain. They don't know what's even happening, right? The doctors didn't tell her, 20 years ago, oh, it looks like you're having this or this problem.
Right.
It's just like, oh, well, she looks like an average person. This is what everyone looks like these days. And let's follow the guidelines. We made all our own food. We weren't eating fast food. We weren't eating at restaurants. We were making our own food. We were eating low fat products. We were doing all the things.
Right.
And every year it just got worse and worse until she succumbed to Alzheimer's. And yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this, but
it's tough, and there can be a genetic component and there can be a vascular component, but the large majority, the correlation is there's issues with body composition, blood glucose regulation, and Alzheimer's. And that's the majority of the population. And listen, of course, like I said before, there's the vascular and then the genetic component, which is not nearly as robust as the other lifestyle components. But, definitely as a society, we are largely misguided. We don't know where to get our information from. And that is a challenge for sure. So really understanding, for take-home points for the listeners is really understanding where the information is coming from, the biases and the viewpoints of the scientists who are speaking or the health providers that are translating that information, and, being open-minded to question the current narratives like, hey, man, maybe we should think about the fact that, cattle and agriculture don't in the US have that big of an impact on climate change or greenhouse gas. And that perhaps, the majority of our food travels 1,300 miles if it's, plant foods. And if you live in Minnesota, you probably shouldn't be eating avocados in the middle of winter if you care about the environment. So there's all these other things as opposed to make it very binary, like this is this or this. It's not black and white.
That's so good that you brought that up, because for one, it's not true, right? We're debunking all the myths of environmental damage, but also to go back to your point of you're sitting next to the bedside of someone with a broken hip who didn't eat enough protein their whole life, didn't have enough muscle mass. Are they caring about the 0.001% difference in the climate change from a cow versus like a piece of broccoli? Yeah. That, like, are they like, oh man, well, I'm so glad that I 0.001% change because I decided to avoid protein. They are devastated and dying.
And, it is a, yes. So no one is saying that they at their, bedside saying, man, I wish I ate more broccoli, but, just getting the science right and thinking that, man, the majority of food, if you really care about the environment, you have to look at transportation, which includes cars and planes, electricity and industry. So, when you really think about if your food matters, arguably if you're eating locally, which is typically, eggs and meat, which travels less than 500 miles, versus, your vegetables that are being shipped from, or your fruit that's being shipped from Chile or whatever. That's really where the conversation is the clarity of the information. Somehow, we think that, people are so concerned that cows are killing the environment or whatever, but the data, the EPA, the data doesn't actually support that. If you really care about the environment, you have to address transportation, food waste.
Oh, I bring that up. I looked up into the data. Like I actually dug into I don't know, it's FAO or the biggest organization data I found. And for one, I think it's like twice as much food waste from plant foods to animal foods.
Yeah. I don't know that number, but I know that we waste like 33% of our food, which decomposes, and it's a problem.
And it creates methane too by decomposing. And just logically, people can kind of know they don't throw away meat and eggs, right? That's precious, expensive stuff. And everyone knows how many times they've brought vegetables and they just go bad and they throw them away. So, but there is data behind it too, I'm saying. And so there's a bigger point that we need to not confuse other nutrition science with other issues. And that's kind of your message this whole time. But I just want to make sure that, again, the people with agenda try to muddy the waters, try to make it about anything else. But first of all, we need to think about humans. Let's think about what human health, and then we could think about it later. Yes, maybe we can do something better. We can grow chickens and pigs better. I get, right? Like chickens and pigs aren't grown. Yes.
We should probably travel less, and we should probably not throw away stuff, and we should probably not use cars and turn off more of our electricity. That there's a million other things that we should do rather than sacrifice the health of humans. So there's this inverse kind of relationship. So yeah, broccoli may have a better agricultural, impact on the climate, or processed sugar might contribute less. But what are the unintended consequences to a human's health? What about the burden it puts on the medical system, and the emotional strain that it puts on families? I mean, truthfully, the majority of fruits and vegetables that we get aren't local. They're shipped somewhere from California or Mexico or Chile or wherever they're from. And that's important. I just think about these things, where it's this emotional conversation. Do you know cars kill 30,000 deers a year? No one talks about that. Right? But people are upset about consuming an animal product. Well, then you shouldn't be driving either.
Exactly.
And what about the aspects of soap and leather and all these other things, petroleum, like all these other things that are used from the animal? So it's not this black and white conversation.
So I just was writing that part of the film actually too.
Cool.
I don't see a lot of other people bringing that up of what's alternative. If we get rid of all these animal products, there are thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of products we make from animals. So now we're going to have to make those from petroleum-based products, fossil fuels.
Glue, soap. This is all made from animal products.
There's so many things, like tennis rackets, strings. There's like medications. There's so many things. So no one ever discusses that. Yeah. And also, I want to get back to some real like tangible, stuff. But there's a great quote that I posted today by my friend Tara Couture, who's in the film. It's great farms. She's a homestead farmer. She said, "It's death on a plate. There's just no blood," referring to all the plant foods. Cool. There's death on a plate. There's just no blood. That will wrap up what we've been saying this whole time, is that for all food, to keep humans alive, there's some sort of toll to the environment. So not only you're talking about flown in vegetables, but we're talking about even deaths of all the smaller animals. And just because you're not eating an animal that's died doesn't mean all the plant foods that you're eating in your smug vegan restaurant doesn't mean they didn't die for you to get this food.
Right. So the conversation is just like you're saying, it's a broken conversation, and it is largely misguided, and the implications of that misinformation is tremendous. So
it's bad. But so I want to get to some like kind of actionable stuff, and
let's talk about that. Let's talk about being forward, okay?
Well, yeah, like protein. Yeah, so that your muscle.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and I'm gonna really kind of just mention this as it relates to overall health and then aging. One of the important things is to determine how much protein you're going to eat. And that's roughly, from my perspective and professional opinion, is 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. Sometimes the carnivore community is lower, keto community may be lower because you guys like to add in more fat or whatever it is. Totally fine. But, from my clinical perspective, making sure 1 gram per pound ideal body weight is fantastic. And this is just a global recommendation. And the next part about that is, how are you going to break it down? And that really is an age-related question. So when you are younger, say my daughter's age, we don't even think about ideal body weight, but she can actually optimize her metabolic pathways from 5 grams or 10 grams of protein, because she's largely driven by hormones. So for an infant,
how old is she? Oh, yeah.
So this is interesting. So the data for childhood is really bad because, typically in adults, they use isotope tracers. They can't use that in kids. So all the data is more extrapolation data and used for breastfeeding and things like that. But the studies for the data for kids is not great. But we do suspect that a very small amount of protein will have the same stimulus impact as we see with meal distribution for adults. And it's largely because it's not an issue of an amino acid threshold in the blood like it is for adults, but it is rather because they're driven by hormones and are highly anabolic. Because they're in a growth phase. So for them, it's, arguably whatever they'll eat, but there are some recommendations. Again, that's the RDA. I can't remember the number for kids. But, then when you move to adults, again, I recommend 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. And then how you break that down is largely based on age. So really an easy takeaway is between 30 and 55 grams per meal, which seems like a lot, but if you're younger, you can get away with less, right? Because you may need a little bit less leucine, which is one of those amino acids, to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And again, muscle protein synthesis doesn't necessarily correlate to laying down muscle like that, but it's the best kind of indicator that we have. If you are an older adult, and when I mean older, I mean it could be anywhere, or have any kind of catabolic conditions, or perhaps are recovering from an illness or bed rest, you are much better suited by having 50 grams of protein per meal. And this is because this will optimize that whole mTOR leucine pathway. And that would be really helpful as it relates to overcoming this concept of anabolic resistance, which is the decreased capacity for muscle to sense and use protein efficiently. And that just has to do with that mechanistic target of rapamycin and how that changes as an individual ages. So if you are older, could be 40s, could be 50s, could be 60s, it can be very helpful to hit around that 50, 55 gram. I don't recommend 1 meal a day. You can get away with it if you're younger, but if you're in your 40s or have any kind of weight issues, I definitely recommend 2 to 3 meals, probably 3 meals. And I think that having that in a compressed feeding window is more ideal because it does allow for bowel rest. And you're not feeding all day long. So those are some really easy takeaway tips. And if you're an individual who eats carbohydrates, don't add it for the first meal of the day. So if you want to have carbohydrates, I think carbohydrate backloading is better. You've been up, you've been moving your muscles, and you have to understand that carbohydrates come in a meal threshold amount. Anything above 40 grams of carbohydrates then creates a more robust insulin response. So really kind of ratcheting that back and keeping carbohydrates, if you're going to eat carbs, below 40 grams per meal. And, 25 grams is probably more ideal to mitigate that insulin response.
I like that too, because in the morning, you don't want to start your day with this bolus of carbohydrates and then kind of be on this roller coaster,
And the first meal of the day is the most important, whatever time that is, because you're coming out of a highly catabolic state. So the body is very primed to utilize those nutrients and very sensitive at that time.
Yeah. I mean, that's why eggs are such a great source of nutrition. It's like, that's a perfect breakfast food. Bacon and eggs, you're getting fat and protein and you're good.
Yeah.
And I love talking about different ways to eat or space out your meals or timing and how many meals per day. I tried OMAD for a while, 1 meal a day. I don't think it's ideal. I think some people maybe can utilize it. I don't know. Yeah, you said you don't exactly recommend it, but
active, you can. You have to think if you're thinking about it mechanistically, are you stimulating muscle tissue throughout the day? And the answer is, well, if you're exercising, you are, but also from a calorie nutrient sensing component, what are the stimulus that you're perpetuating? So we know that muscle requires amino acids. It's much better to stimulate it more than once a day, and the data isn't necessarily clear on how many times, Donald Layman has in his career talked about a 3-meal distribution. Him and I are now developing some newer theories where there's perhaps a cyclical nature to protein ingestion, which I'll be talking more about, on my YouTube and things like that. And so there's components of that can be goal oriented. If weight loss is a goal versus muscle mass versus training recovery, those kinds of things.
Well, yeah, there's very different ways to eat based on your goals. Some people, they need to lose weight. Some people need to maintain. And then some people are trying to build.
Right.
And so people come at me, I'm like, I have no idea what state you're in. And what do you think is the balance though for someone who's in the middle, they're kind of like this maintenance phase and they don't want to be constantly eating? I don't think it's good to constantly be getting these protein and, you're stimulating mTOR and your insulin growth factors and stuff like that.
The biggest stimulus of mTOR is not necessarily protein. So protein and the stimulation of mTOR is exquisitely sensitive in skeletal muscle. But in the liver and the pancreas, you're talking now about insulin-like growth factor, and you're talking about, calories, carbohydrates in other tissues. So I think that's really important for people to understand that the worst thing that you could do is small feeding boluses of carbohydrates throughout the day.
Well, that's what I say, because the vegans and all these, high carb or plant-based people, that they're trying to talk about mTOR and IGF-1. Like, you guys are eating 6 meals a day because of your low quality foods, and you're doing worse.
And there's mTOR complex 1 and mTOR complex 2. mTOR complex 1 is, really when you think about skeletal muscle and those aspects. So, without going off on a tangent, because I'm sure we're coming up on time, they're very different in terms of if you really care about overstimulation of mTOR, which is really, it's a whole nother topic. We should probably record something about this concept of cancer, like what kind of cancer. There's a difference between an initiator and a growth, and a prolongation. It's very convoluted. But if an individual cares about mTOR, and I have a post coming about this, then you have to care about excess calories. And you have to care about other tissues like pancreas and liver. Skeletal muscle and mTOR is that's a good thing.
Yeah. And if you care about excess calories, you should care about getting enough protein so you're full and you're not getting extra, energy.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
All right. Well, yeah, I guess we are ending on time here. Maybe we can have you back on in the future, but where can people find you?
Yeah. Well, you can find me on Instagram, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, Lyon. I have a YouTube, which I've started to do a lot of conversations with Donald Layman. And I really wanted to do this for you guys because, as an academic researcher that he's not often relatable to the public, or they don't have access to him. So we do really short videos and we share a lot of conversations that him and I have personally to share with you guys. And that's on my YouTube. And then I have a website, which is Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. I have a high value newsletter. And I have a protocol if you guys want to read more about what I'm talking about. Yeah. And that's where you can find me, the normal social media channels.
That's great. Well, thanks so much. Yeah, I'm glad you're highlighting this aging stuff and just women in protein too. It seems like just women are scared to eat meat.
It's true. It's interesting. Diana Rogers and I talk about this quite a bit, is that it's this narrative. It's just drink your smoothie and do Pilates. Well, I mean, I can appreciate there's nothing wrong with Pilates, but what about eat meat and lift heavy?
I love that. Yeah. I don't know. We need to change the narrative, and I'm glad that you're doing that. So thanks so much, and we'll see you again sometime.
Yeah. Great connecting.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone. Please share this podcast with family and friends. Give it a review on iTunes or any other podcast app. Find out about our great grass-fed, grass-finished meat products at nosetotale.org. Seasonings, body care, fresh meat, hats. We even got some art coming, some great art from a great artist out of the UK. That's at nosetotale.org. Sapien Program, Sapien Tribe, sapien.org. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week.